Getting to Mars is, in some genuinely important ways, actually the easy part of this entire endeavor. It's a 9-month journey to Mars using technology that already exists today, following orbital mechanics that engineers have understood since the 1960s. The part almost nobody talks about, the part that actually keeps mission planners up at night worrying, is everything that has to go right after landing for years before anyone gets a real chance to come home. And when you actually walk through, step by step, what has to happen between stepping onto Martian soil and stepping back onto Earth, you start to genuinely understand why some of the most respected voices in the space industry treat the return trip, not the arrival, as the real unsolved problem. This isn't a question anyone's asking idly anymore either. With SpaceX publicly targeting crewed Mars missions as early as the 2029 to 2031 launch window, and NASA continuing to develop its own long-term plans for a sustained human presence on the Martian surface, the timeline for actually attempting this has shifted from science fiction to something closer to an active engineering schedule, with real hardware being tested right now, in the present, on Earth, and in orbit, working steadily toward it. Let's start with something most people don't fully realize about traveling to Mars at all. You don't get to just leave whenever you want, on whatever schedule happens to be convenient. Earth and Mars only line up favorably for an efficient transfer roughly once every 26 months, when both planets are positioned correctly relative to the Sun to make the trip achievable within a reasonable amount of fuel and time. Miss that window, and you're not looking at a delay of a few weeks or a rescheduled flight. You're looking at waiting for the next alignment, over 2 years later, burning through consumables, life support margins, and crew patience the entire time. According to current mission architecture proposals, a crew traveling to Mars would spend roughly 6 to 9 months in transit just getting there, depending on the specific trajectory and how much propellant the mission is willing to spend to shorten that window. Once they land, depending on which specific window they used and which trajectory class the mission follows, they could be stuck on the Martian surface for anywhere from several months to well over a year before Mars and Earth realign well enough to make the return trip remotely efficient. Add the months-long trip back, and a full round-trip mission built around what's called a conjunction-class trajectory stretches to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 days, roughly 3 years, door-to-door, most of it spent either in transit or stranded on a planet you can't casually leave, waiting for celestial mechanics to cooperate. There's no version of this mission where a crew simply decides one ordinary afternoon that they'd like to go home a little early. The window either exists, precisely on schedule, dictated entirely by the geometry of 2 planets orbiting the Sun at different speeds, or it doesn't, and no amount of willpower, funding, or mounting urgency changes that fixed calendar. That's before you even get to the part of this story that actual propulsion engineers argue about the most, whether the fuel needed to leave Mars will even exist by the time anyone's ready to use it. This is where the plan that gets the most public attention, SpaceX's Starship architecture, runs into its hardest technical problem, and it's worth walking through exactly why, because the numbers involved are almost absurd in scale. According to Donald Rapp, a chemical engineer who has consulted for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory on Mars missions, a single Starship needs approximately 200 metric tons of propellant just to make the trip from the Martian surface back into space toward Earth. On Earth, you'd simply truck that fuel in from a refinery down the road. On Mars, there's no fuel depot, no supply chain, no backup delivery truck, nothing. The entire plan depends on manufacturing that propellant on site from Martian resources using a process called in-situ resource utilization, or ISRU, extracting water from subsurface ice or regolith, splitting it into hydrogen and oxygen, and combining that with atmospheric carbon dioxide, captured directly from Mars's thin air, to produce liquid methane and liquid oxygen, the same propellants Starship's engines are designed to burn. That process has already been demonstrated in miniature, which is genuinely encouraging, and it's worth giving credit where it's due. NASA's MOXIE experiment, flown aboard the Perseverance rover, successfully produced small amounts of oxygen directly from the Martian atmosphere's carbon dioxide during multiple test runs, proving the underlying chemistry works in real Martian conditions, not just in a lab simulation back on Earth. The problem isn't whether ISRU works in principle, it's whether it can work at the scale an actual return mission requires, reliably, automatically, for months or years, without a human being present to fix it if something breaks. Robert Zubrin, founder of the Mars Society and one of the earliest and most prominent advocates for human Mars exploration, someone who has spent decades actively championing the idea that Mars missions are achievable, not someone looking to talk the project down, has been openly skeptical about the near-term feasibility of exactly this step. Based on estimates that assume Martian regolith contains around 15% water by mass, itself an assumption, since orbital data suggests water may be abundant in some regions, but concrete ground truth confirmation is still limited across the specific sites under consideration. Producing roughly 5 tons of propellant per day would require processing about 33 tons of surface material daily, continuously, using robotic mining and chemical processing equipment operating fully autonomously on another planet months before any human crew ever arrives to check on it, diagnose a fault, or swap out a broken part. Zubrin has stated plainly in analysis reported by Aerospace America that the odds of even an uncrewed Starship successfully making this specific plan work on anything resembling the currently proposed timeline are, in his own words, nearly impossible. And even the logistics of simply getting the empty Starship fueled up in Earth orbit before it ever leaves for Mars reveal how enormous this undertaking really is, well before it even reaches the harder problem of refueling again on the Martian surface. RAP's own estimate puts a single Mars-bound Starship's propellant requirement at around 1,200 tons, refueled in orbit using tanker Starships that carry roughly 100 tons of propellant each, meaning it would take about 12 separate tanker launches just to fill one Starship's tanks before it even begins its journey to Mars, before accounting for what engineers call parasitic losses, the fuel that inevitably boils off or gets lost during each transfer in the harsh thermal environment of space. SpaceX has already begun demonstrating pieces of this process. In 2024, the company successfully transferred 5 metric tons of propellant between 2 tanks on the same Starship, and a full-scale transfer demonstration between 2 separate Starships is planned for 2026. It's real, active engineering work, not vaporware or a slide in an investor presentation. But scaling from a 5-ton demonstration to routinely executing 12-plus flawless orbital refueling operations per mission for every single crewed flight to Mars, going forward, indefinitely, is the kind of gap between demonstrated capability and required capability that mission architects openly flag as one of the biggest open questions in the entire plan. Independent researchers who've tried to model the full mission mass budget have reached even more pointed conclusions. A peer-reviewed analysis published in 2024 examining the feasibility of SpaceX's published Mars mission scenario found significant technological gaps between what's publicly proposed and what current hardware can actually achieve. Running the numbers on total system mass and the resulting trajectory options, the researchers concluded that, based on current plans, the mission architecture as described does not yield a return flight opportunity at all, because the total mass required exceeds what the proposed vehicle can realistically carry and refuel in the time frame available. That's not a minor engineering footnote from a fringe skeptic with an axe to grind. That's an independent, peer-reviewed team publishing through the normal channels of academic scrutiny, concluding that if you follow the publicly stated plan exactly as described, using currently demonstrated technology rather than technology that's merely proposed or hoped for, the math for actually getting the crew back doesn't currently close and would require either a substantially larger vehicle, a meaningfully different mission profile, or capabilities that haven't yet been built or tested at the scale the mission actually demands. This is exactly why every serious mission architecture treats the return propellant question as the single point of failure that everything else depends on. A 2026 paper, proposing what its authors call the Mars Leviathan mission, spells out the stakes directly. The central challenge isn't reaching Mars or even landing safely. It's producing a large enough mass of propellant via ISRU to lift a crew of 12 off the Martian surface and send them back toward Earth. Under that specific proposal, ISRU equipment would need to produce roughly 1,200 metric tons of methane and oxygen propellant over time, all before a Starship carrying actual astronauts could safely commit to the surface, because sending a crew down to a planet that can't yet get them back off it isn't a mission plan. It's an unrecoverable mistake, with no version of a happy ending. Older NASA mission concepts, going back to what's called the Design Reference Architecture, or DRA-5, planned around exactly the same dependency decades earlier, pre-landing an uncrewed Earth return vehicle and letting it spend months or years slowly producing ascent propellant from Martian resources, fully fueled and verified working, before any human being ever leaves Earth's orbit to go join it, a sequencing choice made specifically to avoid the scenario of a crew arriving to find an empty fuel tank waiting for them. Every credible plan for getting astronauts home from Mars, across multiple independent architectures and multiple organizations, spanning both government agencies and private companies, arrives at the same non-negotiable requirement. Prove the fuel exists and works before you commit a crew to the surface. And every one of those same plans depends on a robotic chemical processing system operating unsupervised on an alien planet for months at a stretch, without the option of a human walking over and fixing it if something goes wrong. Even if you assume that problem gets solved, and serious engineers are actively working on solving it, so this isn't a permanently closed door, the astronauts who eventually do get a working return vehicle still have to survive roughly 3 years of physical accumulation of damage before they ever get the chance to use it. This is where the biology becomes just as unforgiving as the chemistry. Start with radiation. Once a crew leaves the protection of Earth's magnetosphere entirely, the invisible magnetic shield that deflects most dangerous particles away from low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station and its astronauts have always operated, safely tucked inside that protective bubble for the entirety of every ISS mission flown to date. They're exposed directly to galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles that originate from outside our solar system entirely, at a rate roughly 3 times higher than what astronauts experience even on long stays aboard the ISS. According to a 2025 review of long-duration spaceflight risks, this isn't some rare exotic hazard, it's a constant, unavoidable feature of the entire transit, for the full 6 to 9 months each way, plus however long the crew spends on the Martian surface itself, where the atmosphere is roughly 1% as thick as Earth's and offers far too little shielding to meaningfully block the same radiation. NASA's own Human Research Program has published detailed documentation on this exact hazard category, and the scientific literature on the associated cancer risk from cumulative radiation exposure over a mission this long is extensive, peer-reviewed, and publicly accessible to anyone who wants to read it without needing any special security clearance or industry connection to find it. Researchers studying how cells repair DNA damage after cosmic radiation exposure have noted that the findings from this specific area of space medicine research are increasingly informing entirely separate fields back on Earth, including the development of new drugs meant to protect cancer patients undergoing radiation treatment. A reminder that the radiation astronauts would absorb on a Mars mission isn't some minor background hum easily dismissed. It's comparable in kind, if not always an exact cumulative dose, to what oncologists work to actively shield patients from during medical treatment right here on Earth. Then there's gravity, or rather, the near-total absence of it for most of the trip. Microgravity during transit causes measurable bone density loss at a documented rate of roughly 1 to 1.5% per month in weight-bearing bones, according to data gathered from astronauts on shorter ISS missions lasting 4 to 6 months. A mathematical model published in the journal PLOS One, built directly from that measured ISS data, specifically femoral neck bone density measurements, from 69 astronauts after both 132-day and 228-day spaceflights, projected what happens over the full duration of an actual Mars mission trajectory, extrapolating that same measured deterioration rate out across the much longer time frame a real Mars mission demands. For a shorter opposition class mission, lasting roughly 400 to 600 days, the model predicted 62% of crew members would develop osteopenia, a clinically significant reduction in bone density that meaningfully increases fracture risk. For the longer conjunction class trajectory, the roughly 3-year, 1,000 to 1,200-day mission that most realistic Mars architectures actually require, given the propellant and window constraints already discussed, the model's prediction was stark. 100% of crew members were projected to develop osteopenia, with a third of them crossing into territory that puts them at real risk for full osteoporosis, a condition normally associated with advanced age and severe fracture risk, developing instead in astronauts who left Earth as some of the most rigorously screened, physically fit human beings on the planet, selected specifically for their exceptional health and conditioning before the mission ever began. Mars itself doesn't offer relief once they land either. Martian gravity sits at only about 38% of Earth's, enough to keep you from floating freely the way you would in transit, but nowhere near enough to fully halt the same muscle and bone deterioration that happens in microgravity, just at a somewhat slower, still measurable rate. Astronauts arriving on the surface after roughly 9 months of essentially weightless travel would be stepping into partial gravity with already measurably weakened skeletons, at meaningfully elevated risk for something as mundane and catastrophic, in that specific context, as a fall resulting in a fracture or a herniated spinal disc from the sudden reintroduction of any gravitational load at all on a body that spent the better part of a year adapting to none, with nothing but months of onboard exercise, routines to try to slow the loss along the way. And even setting aside bones and radiation entirely, there's the simple, grinding psychological weight of the mission itself. A crew heading to Mars is committing to years, not months, inside cramped, closed quarters, with no possibility of resupply, no chance of an early return if something goes wrong, and a communication delay with Earth that stretches up to 22 minutes each way at Mars's farthest distance from Earth, meaning even a simple back-and-forth conversation with mission control becomes a slow, deliberate exchange rather than anything resembling a real-time call, and something as routine as asking a quick, clarifying question can eat up the better part of an hour before an answer comes back. Steve Kozlowski, a psychologist at Michigan State University who studies team dynamics under exactly these kinds of conditions, has pointed out that when relationships between crew members start to strain under that kind of prolonged isolation, people tend to withdraw from each other rather than resolve the tension, which is close to the worst possible outcome on a mission where every single person's daily cooperation is required, just to keep the underlying life support systems running, day after day, for years, with no possibility of simply taking a break from each other or getting some outside space. NASA has taken this risk seriously enough to fund entire simulated missions specifically to study it. Its CHAPIA program, led in its habitat design work by researcher Melody Yashar, puts volunteer crews through extended isolation inside Mars analog habitats here on Earth, specifically to gather data on how confinement, workload, and interpersonal strain build up over long-duration missions before anyone actually has to face those same pressures for real, roughly 40 million miles from the nearest hospital with no simulation exit door to walk through if it all becomes too much. Because that's the other piece of this that rarely gets discussed with the weight it deserves. There is no evacuation option. A published review examining medical risk during long-duration spaceflight and on the Martian surface lays out the problem clinically. The combined effects of space radiation and microgravity touch essentially every organ system in the body, and across a mission lasting roughly 3 years, the review states plainly that the likelihood of an acute, life-threatening medical event, along with newly developed chronic conditions, is meaningfully elevated compared to any mission flown before in the entire history of human spaceflight. The review specifically flags the increased risk of things like lumbar disc herniation and traumatic fracture once the crew reintroduces any gravitational load on bodies that spent months adapting to weightlessness, along with a broader category of medical events that could, in the worst case, require actual surgical intervention performed by whoever happens to be on the crew, using whatever equipment and training they brought along, with no specialist surgeon available to consult, no operating room built for the purpose, and no possibility of stabilizing a patient for transport somewhere better equipped. On the International Space Station, a serious enough medical emergency can, in principle, trigger an emergency return to Earth within hours using a docked Soyuz or crew capsule kept ready specifically for that purpose. On Mars, or in transit to it, that option simply doesn't exist in any form. Whatever goes wrong gets handled by whoever is on board, with whatever medical training and equipment they happen to bring, because the nearest real hospital is, at absolute minimum, months away by the fastest currently achievable trajectory, and likely inaccessible at all until the next transfer window opens, regardless of how urgent the need becomes. Stack all of that together, and you start to see why coming back from Mars isn't really one single problem with one single solution. It's a chain of independent, compounding requirements, each one of which has to succeed, in sequence, for a crew to make it home in anything resembling the condition they left in. The propellant plant has to work autonomously for months without a human troubleshooting it, on a planet where a single failed valve or clogged filter can't simply be swapped out by a technician driving over with a replacement part. The crew has to survive roughly 3 years of radiation exposure, well beyond anything any human being has experienced before, in a controlled or predictable way, with shielding technology that's still actively being developed rather than fully proven at scale. Their bones and muscles have to hold up well enough, even after a year or more of documented, measurable deterioration, that they can physically function during a violent, high-G launch off the Martian surface, strapped into a vehicle accelerating hard enough to challenge even a healthy, Earth-conditioned body. Their psychological cohesion as a small, isolated group has to survive years of confinement with no early exit option, no outside intervention if tensions boil over, and no possibility of simply calling for backup. And through all of it, nothing can go medically wrong that the crew can't handle entirely on their own, with no possibility of outside help arriving in time to matter, no matter how urgent or unexpected the emergency turns out to be. It's worth being honest about what all of this does and doesn't actually prove, because overstating the case doesn't serve anyone either. None of these challenges are physically impossible in the sense that the laws of nature forbid them outright. ISRU propellant production has already been demonstrated, just not yet at the scale a full return mission needs, and there's no fundamental physical law standing in the way of scaling it up, only significant, unsolved engineering challenges. Radiation shielding technology, exercise countermeasures for bone loss, and psychological support protocols are all active areas of ongoing research, not unsolved mysteries with no path forward at all, and meaningful progress continues to be made on each of them year over year. Serious organizations, from NASA to SpaceX to independent research teams at universities around the world, are actively working every one of these problems in parallel right now, specifically because they know a crewed mission can't responsibly launch until each piece is far more mature than it currently is. What the evidence actually supports isn't that returning from Mars is provably impossible, full stop, for all time. It's that every one of these challenges compounds on top of the others across a single uninterrupted, roughly 3-year window with no opportunity to pause, resupply, or abort partway through, in a way that no human spaceflight mission in history has ever had to survive all at once, by a significant margin. It's worth remembering, too, that some of the earliest serious efforts to plan human Mars settlement leaned directly into that reality instead of trying to solve around it. Mars One, a nonprofit initiative that gained significant international attention in the early 2010s, drawing hundreds of thousands of applicants eager for a chance at the mission, explicitly proposed a one-way mission model, arguing that removing the return trip from the mission plan entirely would eliminate an enormous share of the engineering burden and cost, letting settlers focus purely on survival and infrastructure, rather than also solving the return propellant problem from day one. The organization ultimately collapsed under financial and organizational strain before ever launching a single mission, declaring bankruptcy years after first capturing global headlines and drawing enormous public interest. But the core engineering logic behind its one-way premise reflected something real and still relevant today. Removing the return half of the equation genuinely does make near-term Mars settlement dramatically more achievable with current and near-future technology, which is exactly why serious return mission architectures have to treat every one of the problems described here as mandatory, rather than optional, before any crew launches with an actual round-trip plan in hand. Elon Musk himself has never pretended the earliest Mars missions would be risk-free, and it's worth being precise about that, because it means the risk being described here isn't a hidden flaw in the plan that its own architects are downplaying. In public comments made over the years about SpaceX's Mars ambitions, he has repeatedly acknowledged in blunt terms that the first people to go are taking on a mission with a real chance of death, framing it explicitly as a high-risk volunteer endeavor rather than a guaranteed safe round trip comparable to a modern airline flight. That's not a hidden detail buried in a technical paper that only specialists ever see or a footnote nobody bothers to read. It's been stated publicly, directly, repeatedly, by the person leading the organization currently furthest along in actually building the hardware for this exact mission, in interviews and public presentations watched by millions of people around the world. So where does that leave the claim in the title of this video? Not as a settled, provable fact of physics. Nobody can honestly say with certainty today that every single person who ever attempts a Mars mission is guaranteed never to return. But as a genuinely accurate description of the risk the first astronauts to attempt it are actually accepting, it holds up remarkably well against the real, published, peer-reviewed evidence. A functioning return vehicle has to be built, fueled, and verified by robots working alone on another planet for months on end, with no human present to intervene if the process stalls. The crew has to physically and psychologically endure roughly 3 years of documented, measurable bodily deterioration that current medicine still doesn't have a complete solution for, arriving back in a body meaningfully different, in measurable clinical terms, from the one they left Earth with. And every one of those requirements has to succeed simultaneously, with no backup plan if any single piece fails, because there's no rescue mission capable of reaching them in time if something breaks partway through, no matter how sympathetic or well-funded the effort to help would be. None of that means the mission shouldn't be attempted at all. Nearly every major leap in human exploration history, crossing oceans in wooden ships with no reliable way to call for help if something went wrong mid-voyage, flying the first aircraft off a beach in North Carolina, launching the first rockets into orbit atop hardware that had failed catastrophically on prior attempts, carried odds that would look reckless, even irresponsible, by today's safety standards, and every one of them expanded what was possible for everyone who came after, permanently changing what the next generation considered achievable. The difference with Mars is simply that, for the first time in the history of human spaceflight, engineers, doctors, and mission planners can lay out the specific, quantified risks in advance in peer-reviewed detail, rather than discovering them only after the fact, after lives have already been lost learning the hard way. The first crews to attempt this will know, walking in, roughly what they're accepting, in a level of documented detail no explorer in human history has ever had access to before setting out. So here's what I'd ask you to sit with. If you were offered a seat on the first crewed mission to Mars today, knowing everything laid out here, the propellant math that doesn't fully close yet, the radiation exposure no human has ever absorbed before, the bone loss models predicting near universal osteopenia, the total absence of any real rescue option, would you take that seat anyway? Let me know what you decide in the comments, and if you want to read the actual peer-reviewed research this video is built on, the bone density modeling published in PLOS 1, the independent mission feasibility analysis, and the various ISRU propellant studies referenced throughout are all publicly available for anyone who wants to check the numbers for themselves rather than take a video's word for any of it,